My name is Claire Matthews, and on the day I finally walked across the stage to receive my master's degree, I thought I was stepping into one of the proudest moments of my life. Instead, I was staring out into a sea of cheering faces and 5 empty seats in the very front row, each one marked with the names of the people I loved most. I had been dreaming of this moment for 5 relentless years. 5 years of waking before sunrise, working full-time as a project coordinator, racing to evening classes, and burying myself in textbooks on weekends. 5 years of missing school plays, skipping vacations, and telling my friends maybe next time because every spare hour had been spent chasing this goal. I'd worn myself thin, but I believed it would be worth it. Those 5 seats weren't just reserved for bodies. They were placeholders for my family's belief in me, for my husband Mark, for our 2 kids, and for the parents who had raised me to believe in the power of hard work. I'd imagined looking out and seeing them beaming, waving proudly, maybe even crying a little as my name was called. Instead, all I saw was a glaring absence that felt louder than any applause. As the commencement speaker droned on about perseverance and grit, my mind wasn't on the stage. It was wandering back over every late night and missed dinner every time I'd told my kids, "I can't, I have homework." I had done all of it believing this one day would knit those moments together into a story they'd be proud of. But in that instant, I couldn't help but feel like the punchline to a cruel joke. The day I proved I could do it was the day they proved they didn't care enough to show up. I could feel my throat tighten, but I forced my eyes forward. The cameras were everywhere, and I wasn't about to let a live stream capture me breaking down in front of strangers. I told myself I'd ask later. Maybe there had been traffic. Maybe something unexpected came up. But deep down, an old familiar ache had already begun to settle in my chest. The ache of knowing that in my family, other people's priorities always seemed to outrank mine. That was the moment the story you're about to hear truly began, not with the diploma in my hand, but with the emptiness in my heart and those 5 glaring reminders that even the hardest earned victories can feel hollow without the people you thought would be there to share them. And before I tell you the rest, I'll ask you something. If you've ever been let down by the very people you counted on most, stick with me to the end of this story. Because what happened next not only changed the way I saw my family, it changed the way I saw myself. As I stepped down from the stage clutching that hard-earned diploma, a strange stillness washed over me. The cheers around me sounded distant, muffled, as if I were underwater. I'd told myself I would ask questions later, but the absence of my family had already carved a hollow space in my chest. I moved through the crowd of graduates reuniting with their loved ones, each hug and bouquet, a reminder of what I didn't have in that moment. A classmate's father was holding a camera, shouting her name like she'd just won an Olympic medal. Another friend was wrapped in her partner's arms, his pride practically glowing off him. I kept my head down, forcing my lips into something that resembled a smile whenever I locked eyes with someone I knew. That's when my phone buzzed, not with a call or a text from Mark, but with a notification from the alumni network. They'd posted a live photo feed from the ceremony. My instinct was to scroll to see if maybe, just maybe, there was a picture of me that I could send to my parents, proof that I'd done it. But the thought of sharing it with them, with anyone who had chosen not to be here, made my stomach twist. I paused near a bench on the campus lawn, the sun warm on my shoulders. It was the kind of moment where I usually would have pulled out my phone to snap a picture, caption it with something inspiring, and tag my family. But today, it felt like I'd be sending a postcard from a trip no one had wanted to join. I know some people will say it's just one ceremony, it's just a couple of hours. But to me, it was 5 years condensed into a single afternoon. 5 years of sacrifice. 5 years of proving myself. And it was the one time I'd asked them to show up for me, not in a small everyday way, but in a loud, undeniable, we're here because you matter way. I want to pause here and say something to you, yes, you watching this right now. If you've ever had a moment that was supposed to be your victory lap only to have the people you love treat it like an optional errand, you're not alone. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever gone through something similar. I read every single one, and trust me, your story matters here. And if you believe in lifting each other up when the world feels dismissive, hit that subscribe button. Not because algorithms say so, but because together we can be the support system so many of us never had. I took a deep breath and scanned the crowd one last time, looking for any sign of Mark or the kids. I'd told myself they might be running late, that maybe traffic had been worse than expected. I even pictured my son's restless fidgeting in the bleachers, my daughter whispering something silly to make him laugh. I wanted so badly to believe they were just minutes away from appearing. But as the minutes stretched on, hope thinned like smoke. I could feel the sting of disappointment starting to settle into something sharper: suspicion. And with suspicion came an old, unwelcome voice in my head. You already know where they are, you just don't want to admit it yet. The ceremony wrapped up with a wave of applause, and the graduates began spilling out onto the quad cameras, flashing laughter echoing. I walked slowly toward the exit, my diploma tucked under my arm like a fragile thing. I thought about calling Mark right then, but something stopped me. It was the same reason you don't call someone in the middle of the night when you know they're not where they said they'd be, because you already know the answer, and hearing it out loud will only make it worse. I headed toward the campus fountain where we'd all agreed to meet afterward. The crowd was thinning now, families drifting toward restaurants and parking lots. I waited and waited. Every passing minute chipped away at my composure. My smile felt like a mask that no longer fit. Finally, I pulled out my phone, stared at the dark screen, and thought this was supposed to be our day. Not just mine. Ours. And yet somehow I was the only one who had shown up. That's when I decided if I was going to find out where they were, it wasn't going to be from guessing. It was going to be from the truth, however ugly it turned out to be. And that truth was coming sooner than I thought. To understand why those empty seats hit me so hard, you need to know a little about my family and the unspoken rules we all seem to live by. I grew up in a small town in Oregon, the middle child between two brothers. My older brother James was the golden boy from day one. Quarterback of the high school football team, prom king, the kind of kid teachers used as an example for the rest of us. My younger brother Ryan was the baby, endlessly charming, quick with a joke, and somehow always excused from the consequences the rest of us had to face. And then there was me, the responsible one. I got straight A's, worked part-time jobs to save for college, and was the first in our family to move out for school. My parents didn't dislike me. It's not that simple, but they never lit up for me the way they did for James. I'd win a debate championship and they'd say, "That's nice, honey." James would land a sponsorship for his car detailing business, and they'd throw a party. It's a strange thing growing up as the reliable one. People stop asking if you need anything because they assume you've got it covered. They stop showing up to your events because of course you'll do fine without them. The attention, the pride, the fanfare that's reserved for the ones who make them feel excited, not the ones who make them feel secure. Even as adults, the pattern stuck. James's milestones were family affairs, cookouts, trips, weekends planned around his schedule. When I got my bachelor's degree in business administration, my parents sent a card in the mail and said they couldn't make it because they had tickets to one of James's boating events. I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need the applause. But the truth, it leaves a mark. You start to feel like no matter what you accomplish, it will always be filed under less important in their minds. Mark, my husband, had seen this dynamic play out for years. He used to joke that marrying me meant marrying into the James show. But even he didn't fully get it, or maybe he didn't think it was as deep as I did. Mark's family was different. They were loud and supportive, the kind of people who'd show up with banners for a neighborhood 5K. So when I started my master's program, I made a silent vow. This time my family was going to see me. Not just hear about what I was doing in passing. Not just send a text with a thumbs up emoji. They were going to sit in those seats, watch me cross that stage, and know exactly what I'd been working toward. I told them early, almost a year in advance. It's going to be the second Saturday in May, I said over Thanksgiving dinner. I'm getting 6 tickets, 1 for each of you. No excuses. My mom smiled. My dad nodded, and James said he'd try to make it work. Even that lukewarm response felt like progress. Mark promised he'd keep the kids' schedules clear. He said they need to see this, Claire. They need to know what hard work looks like. And I believed him. I wanted our son and daughter to feel proud to see their mom as more than the person who packed lunches and paid bills. In my head, I pictured the moment walking out of the auditorium afterward, finding them in the crowd, my kids running toward me with flowers, Mark pulling me into a hug, my parents snapping pictures, maybe even James admitting he was impressed. That image kept me going on nights when my eyes burned from staring at spreadsheets after a full day at work. But if there's one thing I should have learned by now, it's that in my family, even the most important dates have a way of being replaced. James could throw a last-minute event, and suddenly whatever you had planned didn't seem to matter anymore. And yet a part of me, maybe the part that still wanted to be the daughter worth celebrating, believed this time would be different. I didn't know it then, but that belief was about to be tested in a way that would make every past slight look small. Because as the weeks ticked down toward graduation, James's name was about to come up again. And when it did, everything I'd built this moment on would start to crumble. 3 weeks before graduation, the email from James landed in my inbox with the subject line, "Big news, save the date." I clicked it expecting some generic family update, maybe another one of his sailing competitions. Instead, there it was in bold letters. Annual Matthews Family BBQ, Saturday, May 14th, my place. I froze. That date wasn't just familiar. It was burned into my brain. My graduation. The one date I'd been repeating for nearly a year to anyone with ears. The one day I'd asked everyone to hold sacred. I read the rest of the email, scanning for some kind of acknowledgement that he knew about the conflict. There was none. Just a rundown of the epic menu, the live band he'd hired, and a list of activities for the kids, including a new poolside water slide. He even attached a photo of it sparkling under the sun like the world's shiniest bribe. I called him immediately. "James, you realize that's my graduation day, right?" There was a pause on the other end, like he was trying to remember if that was actually true. Then, oh, right, I guess I forgot. Forgot my voice was climbing. I told you months ago. Multiple times. Yeah, but this was the only weekend my band guy was available, and a bunch of my clients are in town. It's kind of a big networking thing for me, too. So you scheduled a party on top of my graduation and invited the whole family, because your band guy couldn't do another weekend. He chuckled like I was being ridiculous. "Come on, Claire, it's just a graduation. You already had one for your bachelor's. This is basically the same thing, right?" Those words hit me like a slap. Just a graduation. As if the 5 years I'd spent juggling work, school, and family were nothing but a hobby I could have dropped at any time. "James," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I expect you there. I expect Mom and Dad there. This is important to me." "Well," he sighed, "Mom and Dad already said they'd be at my place. Aunt Linda and Uncle Joe are coming in from Florida, and you know how rarely they visit. But hey, maybe you can swing by after your thing. I'll save you a plate." It was so casual, so dismissive, that I actually laughed, the kind of laugh that's too sharp to be funny. "You want me to swing by my brother's barbecue after the day I've worked half a decade for so you can hand me cold ribs in the driveway?" "Don't be dramatic," he said. "It's not that deep." That was the moment I realized this wasn't a scheduling conflict. This was the same old pattern, just dressed up with a band and a buffet. James threw something shiny into the calendar, and the family flocked to him without a second thought about what they'd be skipping. I hung up before my temper boiled over completely. My hands were shaking as I dialed my mother's number. She answered on the second ring. "Mom, please tell me you're not going to James's barbecue instead of my graduation." "Oh, honey," she said with that tone that always meant she thought I was overreacting. "It's just terrible timing, isn't it? Can't you both reschedule?" "No, Mom. You don't reschedule a university commencement. It's been set for a year." "Well, it's just, your father really wants to see Aunt Linda and Uncle Joe, and James has been so excited about this. So excited that he forgot the date of the one milestone I've been working toward for years." "You know your brother," she said gently, as if that explained everything. I did know him. I knew him well enough to understand that this was deliberate in its own way, maybe not malicious, but built on the quiet confidence that whatever he wanted would always come first. And I knew my parents well enough to know they'd follow where he led. When I hung up, my chest felt heavy, but I clung to one lifeline, Mark. My husband wouldn't let me down. He'd promised that he and the kids would be there no matter what. That night I told him about the calls. He shook his head. "Your family's always been like this, Claire. But don't worry. Me and the kids were your fan club. We'll be there." I believed him. At least I wanted to. Because if he didn't mean it, I wasn't sure I could handle what that would say about us. For the next couple of days I tried to shake it off. James's arrogance, my parents' predictable choice, none of it mattered as long as Mark and the kids showed up. That was my lifeline, the one constant I thought I could count on. Mark had been there through every late-night study session, every exam week, meltdown every time I nearly talked myself out of finishing the program. He'd picked up extra chores when I had group projects due, helped the kids with homework, when I was buried under case studies, and listened to my practice presentations more times than I could count. I told myself he understood exactly how much this day meant to me. One night after dinner, I found myself rehearsing what the ceremony might be like. I want the kids to see me walk across that stage, I told him as we cleared the table. I want them to hear my name and know that's their mom up there. I want them to feel proud. They will, he said, without looking up from stacking the dishes. We'll be there front row. You've got nothing to worry about. It should have comforted me. But there was something in the way he said it automatic, like he was repeating a line he knew I needed to hear, rather than something he'd truly thought about. I pushed the thought aside. The next weekend, I tried to build some excitement for the kids. We're going to Mommy's graduation in 2 weeks, I said over Saturday breakfast. It's a big deal. My son Liam barely looked up from his cereal. Isn't Uncle James having a barbecue that day? He said he has a new water slide. I blinked. Yes, but you'll be at my ceremony. Remember, this is a once-in-a-lifetime thing for me. My daughter Ava frowned thoughtfully. But all our cousins will be at the pool. I forced a smile. And you'll get to tell them later that you watched your mom graduate with her master's degree. Not everyone gets to say that. They didn't look convinced, but I told myself it was just kid stuff. Of course, a pool sounded more fun than sitting in an auditorium for a few hours. That's why parents decide what's important, because kids can't always see the big picture. Later that day, I overheard them in the backyard, Liam telling Ava that maybe they could go to both if they skipped part of the ceremony. I stepped outside the words forming in my mouth to set them straight, but then I stopped. This wasn't their fault. This was the result of James dangling his shiny toy at exactly the wrong time. That night, as Mark and I sat on the couch, I told him about what I'd heard. You need to make sure they understand this isn't optional, I said. He sighed. Claire, they're kids. Of course they want to go where the fun is, but they'll be there. I promised you that. And here's where I want to pause and ask you, watching this, have you ever been in that position? Where you've been given someone's word and you want to believe it so badly, you ignore the little warning bells going off in your head. Tell me in the comments. I want to hear if I'm not the only one who's tried to trust through doubt. The closer we got to the date, the more I clung to Mark's promise. I poured myself into the final weeks of my program, finishing a marketing strategy paper, wrapping up group presentations, and polishing my thesis defense. I even booked a nice Italian restaurant for after the ceremony. 8 seats. I kept them reserved even though I knew 2 of those spots would stay empty without my parents. When I picked up my cap and gown from the campus bookstore, I imagined Liam and Ava helping me get ready that morning, maybe even holding my hands as we walked into the auditorium. I pictured Mark's proud smile in the crowd. Those images became my shield against the gnawing feeling that somehow this could still go sideways. And if I'd listened closely enough to that feeling, if I'd let myself follow it instead of pushing it down, maybe I wouldn't have been so blindsided by what came next. Because the cracks in that promise were already forming, and soon they wouldn't be cracks anymore. The week before graduation, everything felt like it was clicking into place. My final grades came in straight A's, and my thesis advisor emailed me with a note so kind I actually printed it out and pinned it above my desk. My gown hung pressed and ready in the closet. The navy dress I'd splurged on was draped over the chair in my room, and the dinner reservation was confirmed. I should have been able to breathe easy. But every so often I'd catch a tone in Mark's voice or notice how he'd change the subject when I talked about the ceremony, and that same little warning bell would ring in my head. On Wednesday evening, as I was going over the guest tickets one last time, I heard laughter coming from the kitchen. It was Mark on speakerphone with someone, and then I recognized James's voice. Yeah, man, James was saying, the kids are gonna love it. Slide's a hit already. You bring them early and they'll have the whole thing to themselves before the other kids get here. My hands froze on the table. Bring them early. Mark chuckled. They've been talking about it all week. Ava can't stop asking if Jasmine will be there. I stepped into the doorway, my heart thudding. Mark, what's going on? He looked over his shoulder, startled, and fumbled to turn off the speaker. Oh, James was just telling me about the barbecue. I heard you say something about bringing the kids early. Mark's eyes darted away. They've been begging to go for a little while before the ceremony. I figured maybe we could, compromise. Compromise. My voice was rising. Mark, there is no compromise. They either come to the ceremony or they don't. They'll still see you afterward, he said, like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. We could meet at the restaurant. I cut him off. This is not a dinner date we can shuffle around. This is the reason I've been killing myself for 5 years. And you promised me you'd be there with them. He spread his hands like he was calming a wild animal. Claire, think about it from their perspective. 3 hours of sitting still while names are called, or a couple of hours in the pool with their cousins. They'll remember the fun, not the boredom. I stared at him, barely able to form words. They'll remember that when something mattered to their mother, she was alone because fun won. The conversation ended there, not because we resolved anything, but because I couldn't trust myself to keep talking without saying something I couldn't take back. I went upstairs, shut the bedroom door, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the dress I'd been so excited to wear. For the first time, I thought about canceling the dinner reservation. I want to pause here for a second because I'm curious. If you were in my shoes, what would you do? Would you insist, risk a fight, and make sure they came? Or would you let them go just to avoid the tension on what was supposed to be your big day? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone, and I think this is something more of us go through than we admit. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those 5 empty seats lined up in my mind, my parents gone, James never planning to come, and now maybe Mark and the kids too. It felt like the walls of my perfect graduation day were closing in. The next morning, Mark acted like nothing had happened. He kissed me on the forehead before leaving for work, told me not to stress, said everything would work out. I nodded, but I didn't believe him, because deep down, I knew something I hadn't wanted to say out loud. Once James dangled that water slide in front of my kids, Mark wasn't going to fight to keep them at the ceremony, and I was about to find out just how right I was. Graduation morning began with a silence so heavy it felt deliberate. No sound of cartoons drifting from the living room, no clatter of cereal bowls in the kitchen, just the muted hum of the refrigerator and the weight of my own heartbeat. I padded downstairs, still in my robe, expecting to find Mark making breakfast with Liam and Ava hovering around him. Instead, there was only a folded sheet of paper sitting in the middle of the counter. Took the kids to James's early to help set up. We'll try to make it back for your ceremony. Congrats, Mark. I read it twice, then a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something that didn't feel like a knife between my ribs. Try to make it back. As if my graduation were some optional stop between flipping burgers and inflating pool floats. I stood there so long the coffee pot beeped its auto-off warning. Eventually, muscle memory took over and I made myself a cup, but my hands were shaking so badly that I sloshed it onto the counter. The house felt like a crime scene, each empty chair and untouched breakfast bowl a piece of evidence. Upstairs, my gown hung perfectly pressed, the dress beneath it, waiting like an artifact of a day that no longer felt like mine. I showered, dressed, and moved through my hair and makeup appointments in a haze, nodding politely to the stylists without actually hearing their small talk. Back home, I slipped into the navy dress, zipped my gown, and straightened my cap in the mirror. I took a selfie, part habit, part defiance, and posted it with the caption, 5 years. Countless nights. One day that matters. I tagged my family out of instinct, though I knew better than to expect a flood of responses. By the time I pulled into the university's parking garage, the sidewalks were alive with families carrying flowers and balloons. Little kids waved handmade signs. Parents wore college hoodies and beamed as they posed with their graduates. I walked alone. Inside the auditorium, ushers guided me to the lineup for my department. My phone stayed in my hand like a talisman, even though I knew it wouldn't buzz. A couple of friends sent good luck texts. Mark, nothing. The kids, nothing. My parents, silence. When the processional music began, we filed into the hall, our footsteps echoing. I glanced up into the audience out of habit, scanning the rows for a familiar face. All I saw were strangers. Row after row of strangers cheering for someone else. The ceremony unfolded exactly as planned. Speeches about perseverance, calls for lifelong learning, polite applause after each name. When mine was called, I walked across the stage with my head high, smiled for the camera, and shook the dean's hand. I even remembered to move my tassel. But inside, the moment felt like a dress rehearsal for a play no one I loved had shown up to see. Back in my seat, diploma in hand, I told myself I wouldn't cry. Not here. Not in front of these people. I clapped for the rest of the graduates, but my mind kept drifting to a backyard just a few miles away. A backyard where my husband and kids were probably laughing, eating ribs, and sliding into a pool while I sat here pretending not to notice their absence. When the ceremony ended, we spilled out onto the quad. Friends reunited with their families, cameras flashed, champagne corks popped. I stood alone under a tree diploma case tucked under my arm, waiting for a phone call that never came. And then against my better judgment, I opened social media. The first post I saw was from James, a photo of the pool crowded with cousins, Mark in the background holding a plate piled high with food. Liam mid-laugh, Ava floating on a pool raft. The caption read, "Perfect day with the fam," the timestamp. 3:17 p.m., the exact moment I had been walking across the stage. My throat closed up. I closed the app before my vision blurred completely. This was supposed to be my day. Instead, it was proof that I'd been right all along. When my achievements competed with James's spotlight, I would always lose. And yet I had no idea that within hours, the choice they'd made would come back to haunt all of us in a way that would rip the day apart entirely. The quad outside the auditorium was buzzing with joy bouquets being handed over camera shutters, clicking in rapid bursts, tassels tossed into the air. But for me, every sound felt like static. I stood off to the side, diploma clutched so tightly in my hands that the leather edge dug into my palm. I told myself to breathe, to take in the moment for myself, even if no one I loved was here to witness it. But then curiosity got the better of me, that ugly, self-destructive urge to know. I pulled my phone from my bag and opened social media again against every warning bell in my head. James's post was still there, pinned to the top of my feed like a billboard mocking me. A panoramic shot of his backyard grill, smoking beer bottles lined up on the table, kids splashing in the pool. Front and center was Liam dripping wet, holding a skewer of marshmallows over the fire pit. Ava sat beside him with her hair slicked back, laughing at something out of frame. And there, in the far background, Mark stood chatting with my father, plate piled high with food. The caption read, "Couldn't ask for a better day with the people who matter most." The timestamp stabbed at me, 3:17 p.m. The exact moment I'd been on stage, smiling for a camera, trying to pretend that the people who mattered most to me weren't missing. I closed the app so fast my thumb hurt. My face burned equal parts humiliation and rage. They weren't running late. They weren't trying to make it. They'd never planned to be here at all. I wandered toward the fountain in the center of campus, a landmark where graduates met their families for photos. I lingered there longer than I should have, watching hugs and kisses play out in front of me, like scenes from a movie I'd never been cast in. A classmate spotted me and came over, bouquet in hand, beaming. "Congrats, where's your crew?" she asked. I swallowed hard. "Busy," I said, forcing a smile. "They'll catch up with me later." It was a lie so thin I could hear it tear as I said it. When she left, the dam inside me finally cracked. I slipped behind the science building where the crowd thinned, found a patch of shade, and let the sobs tear out of me. They were the kind of cries that start low in your chest and take over your whole body, the kind that leave your makeup ruined and your throat raw. I cried for the 5 years of missed dinners, for the times I told my kids later and believed they'd understand, for every night I stayed up until 2 a.m. to make this dream real. I cried for the photo they'd just posted, proof that when they had to choose, they chose him again. I don't know how long I stayed there, but eventually I realized my phone had been buzzing in my bag. Dozens of times. When I pulled it out, my heart stuttered. 45 missed calls from Mark, all in the last hour. My mind spun. An emergency, something with the kids, my parents. I tapped to call him back, my hands clumsy. He answered on the first ring, voice high-pitched with panic. "Claire, thank God. I've been trying to reach you for over an hour." "What happened? Is everyone okay?" "It's Liam," Mark blurted. He was showing off on the new water slide, climbed up the side, slipped. "We're at Memorial Hospital. The doctor thinks his arm's broken." For a second, everything went white in my head. "I'm coming," I said, already moving toward the parking garage in my heels. "Is he in pain?" "They gave him something, but he's shaken up. He keeps asking for you." That last sentence landed like a stone in my chest. After everything, now he wanted me there. I didn't even take off my gown. I drove straight to the hospital diploma case on the passenger seat, cap tossed somewhere in the back. And all the way there, one question looped in my mind like a cruel refrain. Why did it take an accident for my presence to matter? If you've been following this story, you already know what's coming next, is where everything tilts, the point where pride hurt, and years of quiet resentment collide in one sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway. I pulled into Memorial Hospital, still wearing my cap and gown, the navy fabric swishing around my legs, as I half ran toward the ER entrance. Every step echoed in my ears louder than the automatic doors sliding open. The moment I stepped inside, I saw them, my entire family. James was slouched in a chair near the wall, scrolling through his phone like this was just another stop in his day. My parents sat beside him, murmuring to each other. Mark was pacing, and when his eyes met mine, he froze. For a moment, no one spoke. The gown made me impossible to miss. and I could see the flicker of recognition in their faces, the silent acknowledgement that they'd chosen somewhere else to be when I walked across that stage. "Where is he?" I asked, my voice clipped. Mark gestured toward a curtained bay, second on the right. "He's been asking for you." I didn't wait for anything else. I pushed through the curtain to find Liam sitting on the exam bed arm in a temporary splint, cheeks streaked with dried tears. His eyes lit up when he saw me. "Mom." I hugged him carefully, mindful of the injury. "I'm here, buddy. It's okay." The doctor came in, then explaining that the break was clean and would heal well, but Liam would need a cast for several weeks. I nodded through the instructions, my focus split between my son's face and the weight of everything outside that curtain. When the doctor left, Liam's voice was small. "Sorry I missed your graduation." Something in me splintered. He was just a kid caught in the middle of a dynamic he didn't create. "You're more important than any ceremony," I told him, and I meant it. But a part of me whispered that it shouldn't have been an either-or choice. When I stepped back into the hallway, the air between me and the rest of them was thick enough to choke on. James looked up from his phone. "He'll be fine. Kids bounce back." I stared at him, unable to stop the words. "Do you have any idea what today was for me?" He shrugged. "It's just school, Claire. You've always been good at that." Mark cleared his throat like he wanted to diffuse it. "Let's not do this here." "No," I said, my voice steady now. "Let's do it exactly here, in the one place where for once you all had to stop what you were doing and show up. Pity it took a broken bone to make it happen." My parents shifted uncomfortably, but no one argued. Maybe they knew there was nothing they could say that wouldn't make it worse. I turned to Mark. "You promised me. You promised you and the kids would be there today." And instead, I walked across that stage to a row of empty seats. "You didn't even text. You didn't even pretend you tried." He opened his mouth, but I cut him off. "Save it. I've spent years telling myself I didn't need your support the way I saw you give it to other people. But today proved I was lying to myself." Silence followed me as I walked back to Liam's room. "And here's the thing I want you to think about. This: what do you do when the people you rely on the most prove in the clearest way possible that you're not their priority? Do you keep fighting for a place in their lives? Or do you start building a life where their absence doesn't hollow you out?" That was the question running through my head as I sat beside my son's bed, holding his good hand, wondering if this hospital room was the real beginning of my independence, or just another scene in a story where I kept forgiving what I shouldn't. And I had no idea that within days I'd get my answer in a way none of us could ignore. 2 days after the hospital, you would have thought everything had gone back to normal. Liam had his new blue cast, Ava was helping him sign it with glitter pens, and Mark was acting like the barbecue versus graduation fiasco had never happened. But under that veneer, the tension was so sharp I could almost hear it hum. I'd stayed quiet at first, not because I'd forgiven anyone, but because I needed time to decide how I was going to handle this without it becoming just another scene they could dismiss as Claire being dramatic. That Sunday, we went to my parents' house for what was supposed to be a low-key dinner. The smell of roast chicken filled the kitchen, the table was set for 8, and everyone was there. James, my parents, Mark, the kids. From the outside, it might have looked like a family gathering. To me, it felt like a lineup. Halfway through the meal, my mom said almost casually, "We should all plan something for the 4th of July. Maybe another big barbecue at James's." I set my fork down. "Maybe we could plan something that isn't at James's for once." The room stilled. My dad cleared his throat. "Claire?" "No, really," I continued, my voice calm but firm. "Because the last time we all rallied for something at James's, I walked into my graduation alone." James rolled his eyes. "Are we seriously still on this?" Liam broke his arm. "Claire, it wasn't like we skipped it for nothing." I looked straight at him. "Liam broke his arm after you all decided not to show up. Let's not pretend it was the reason you weren't there." Mark shifted in his seat. "Claire?" "No," I said, sharper this time. "I need to say this. For years I've watched this family drop everything for James. New business venture, everyone's there. Last-minute party, everyone's there. My milestones. I'm lucky if I get a text. I've been quiet about it because I thought maybe it was in my head, or maybe if I worked harder I'd earn that same kind of loyalty." My mom's voice was gentle but full of that old patronizing patience. "Honey, it's not a competition." "Yes, it is," I snapped, "when you keep score without realizing it. And you've made it very clear who's worth showing up for. It's just never been me." For a long moment, no one said a word. The clink of cutlery from the kids' plates was the only sound in the room. Then James leaned back in his chair, smirking like this was all beneath him. You've always been too sensitive. That's your problem. I felt the anger rise in me, hot and fast. No, my problem was thinking I had to keep proving myself to people who'd already decided I wasn't enough. And I'm done. I'm not asking you to show up for me anymore. I'm not going to give you another chance to choose someone else over me because you've made your choice clear every single time. Mark's eyes flicked to me, a flash of something I couldn't quite read. Guilt, embarrassment, but he didn't say a word. I pushed my chair back and stood. Liam, Ava, grab your things. We're going. My mom started to protest, but I held up my hand. This isn't a fight. It's a boundary, and it's long overdue. We left in silence, the night air cool against my skin as we walked to the car. I could feel the weight of my words still hanging in the house behind us, but for the first time in years, I didn't care how they landed. Because this wasn't about getting them to see me anymore. It was about finally seeing myself and realizing that the only approval I needed was my own. What I didn't know then was that my boundary would set off a chain reaction I hadn't planned, for one that would force Mark to choose which side of the line he was really on. 2 days after that dinner, Mark came home from work later than usual. I was in the kitchen, rinsing dishes, still replaying the scene from my parents' table in my mind. He dropped his keys on the counter and leaned against it, arms crossed. "We need to talk," he said. My stomach tightened. About what? He hesitated, then sighed. About Sunday night, and about the way you spoke to my family. My family. The phrase hit me harder than it should have. Your family. You mean my parents and my brother. He looked down at the counter like the grain of the wood was suddenly fascinating. You know what I mean? You came at them in front of everyone, Claire. It was a lot. I dried my hands slowly. It was a lot for me too, Mark. Walking into my graduation alone, seeing you in the background of James's party photos, watching our kids celebrate with him while I stood by myself, that was a lot. He exhaled through his nose, a sound halfway between annoyance and resignation. I didn't want to ruin the day with an argument. I thought maybe if I kept things calm, we could keep the peace I cut in. You mean keep their peace, at my expense, again. Something in his jaw twitched. Claire, you make everything a battle. Sometimes it's easier to just go along. I leaned against the opposite counter, crossing my arms. Easier for who? Because it's not easier for me standing in the middle of an empty row while the people I love are eating ribs by the pool. It's not easier for me to explain to my kids why their dad thought a barbecue was more important than their mom's once-in-a-lifetime moment. Mark didn't answer right away, and in that silence something clicked. This isn't just about the graduation, is it? I said quietly. You've been choosing them over me for a long time. Little things I didn't notice or didn't want to notice. The holidays we spent at James's because it was tradition. The weekends you canceled plans with me because James needed a hand with something. Even the times you brushed off things I said when they contradicted him. His face flickered guilt, then defensiveness. They're my family, Claire. I'm not going to turn my back on them. They're mine too, I shot back. And I'm not asking you to turn your back. I'm asking you to have mine. Just once. Just long enough for me to feel like I'm not standing alone in my own marriage. He looked at me for a long moment, and I realized he didn't have an answer, because if he admitted the truth, he'd have to face what it meant. You've been protecting the comfort of a family that's fine without you, I said, my voice steady. But you haven't been protecting the woman who actually counts on you. He started to speak, but I shook my head. No, I'm not having this conversation if it's just going to be more excuses. I'm asking you to think about what side you're on, because I can't keep living like you're on both. That night, we barely spoke. He sat in the living room, scrolling his phone, and I stayed in the bedroom with a book I couldn't focus on. The silence between us felt like the opening in a frozen lake, black cold and dangerous if you stepped wrong. The next morning he left early without saying goodbye, and later I learned where he went, a coffee shop near James's office. Because apparently instead of thinking about my words, he'd gone straight to my brother. And whatever they said in that meeting would be the match that set fire to everything left between us. The thing about betrayal is that it rarely knocks on the front door. It slips in quietly through a side entrance you didn't even know existed, and by the time you notice, it's already sitting at your table. 2 mornings after our argument, I was making coffee when my phone buzzed with a text from an old friend, Rachel, who worked at a cafe downtown. Hey, just saw Mark here with James. They've been talking for over an hour. You okay? I stared at the screen, the steam from the coffee maker curling between us like a question mark. Mark had told me he had an early meeting with a client. Apparently, the client's name was my brother. Part of me wanted to ignore it, pretend it was nothing more than a friendly coffee. But the other part, the part that had been ignored, sidelined, and replaced one too many times, knew better. When Mark came home that evening, I didn't confront him right away. Instead, I asked how his client meeting went. He said fine, nothing unusual. That was my answer. Not in the details he gave, but in the ones he didn't. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark living room, the glow from my phone lighting my hands as I scrolled through my thoughts more than any screen. What could they have been talking about that required secrecy? What could James have to say about me that needed to be said in private without my knowing? And here's where I'll pause and put the question to you. What would you do if you found out your partner and the one person who's hurt you the most were meeting behind your back? Would you wait for them to tell you, or would you go looking for the truth yourself? I decided I wasn't going to wait. The next day, I stopped by the cafe under the pretense of grabbing a latte. Rachel greeted me with a look that said she knew more than she wanted to. As she slid my drink across the counter, she leaned in. They weren't just catching up. James had papers, looked like bank statements or some kind of agreement. He was pushing them across the table like he wanted Mark to sign something. I felt the floor tilt. My mind ran wild. Were they trying to buy something together, invest? Or was James using Mark to get his way in yet another family matter I'd be excluded from? I thanked Rachel, left a generous tip, and walked back to my car in a daze. All I knew was that my marriage was now tangled up in whatever James was orchestrating. And given his track record, I doubted it was anything that would end in my favor. That night, I watched Mark more closely than ever. The way he avoided eye contact when I asked about his day. How he took his phone into the bathroom and stayed there longer than usual. How he set his work bag down next to the couch instead of his usual spot in the kitchen, like he didn't want me to see what was inside. The silence between us had turned into a chess match, each of us waiting for the other to make the first move. I didn't know what the endgame was, but I had a feeling I was about to find out, and that once I did, there'd be no going back. Because sometimes the truth doesn't just change the game, it flips the board over entirely. And whatever was written on those papers James slid across that cafe table, that was going to flip mine. The answer came sooner than I expected, and not because Mark decided to tell me. 2 days after the cafe meeting, I was folding laundry in the bedroom when I heard the front door click shut. Mark had left for work an hour earlier, so whoever it was had come back for something. I peeked through the blinds and saw his car still in the driveway. He was on the porch phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and tense. I couldn't make out the words, but I caught one phrase clear as day: she won't know until it's done. My stomach clenched. He stepped back inside, clearly unaware I was upstairs. His work bag was slung over his shoulder, but this time he didn't head for the door. Instead, he placed a thick manila envelope on the hall table and went straight into the bathroom. I don't know if it was instinct or survival, but I was moving before I could second-guess myself. I snatched the envelope, slipped into the guest room, and shut the door. Inside were a dozen neatly stapled packets, legal-looking documents, some with bank logos at the top. My eyes darted across words and numbers until they landed on the one line that made my pulse pound in my ears. Transfer of joint property interest, Claire Jensen to James Jensen. I scanned further. It was our lake cabin. The one Mark and I had bought together 5 years ago, the one place that felt truly mine after a lifetime of living in my family's shadow. And there it was in black and white, a plan to sign my name away without me even knowing. The signature line under my printed name was blank, but the page beside it, a consent authorization, had Mark's signature already scribbled across it. I sat there staring, the betrayal unfolding in layers. It wasn't just that James wanted my cabin. It was that Mark was helping him take it, and they were doing it behind my back, banking on the idea that I wouldn't find out until it was too late. I slid the papers back exactly as I'd found them and returned the envelope to the hall table. By the time Mark came out of the bathroom, I was in the kitchen pretending to scroll my phone. "Forgot something?" I asked, casual. He nodded, picking up the envelope. "Just some paperwork I need to drop off." I smiled, and it wasn't the kind of smile he'd want to see. "Hope it works out for you." He froze for half a second, like he wondered whether I knew. But then he recovered, mumbling something about being late, and left. The second the door shut, I felt the anger harden into something sharper: resolve. I could have confronted him right then. Could have called James, screamed down the phone, told him exactly what I thought of his petty, greedy little power plays. But where would that leave me? Cornered, defensive, playing their game. No, I needed to flip the script. If they thought they were going to blindside me, I'd let them think it was working, until the moment I had everything lined up to hit back in a way they couldn't undo. That night, lying beside Mark in bed, I stared at the ceiling and thought about the cabin, about how much of myself I'd poured into that place, and about how satisfying it would be to watch their faces when they realized I'd known all along and had already made my move. They thought they were playing chess. I was about to turn it into checkmate, but first I had to keep my mask in place. Because the one thing more dangerous than an enemy who hates you is an enemy who thinks you don't see them coming. When you've been underestimated for long enough, you learn to use it like a weapon. Mark and James had no idea they'd just handed me the perfect opportunity. The first step was information. I wasn't going to march into battle without knowing every detail of what they were trying to pull. The next morning after Mark left for work, I drove to the county records office. If there was any official movement on the cabin, it would be filed there. The clerk, a woman in her 60s with sharp glasses and a sharper memory, pulled the latest documents for our property. Nothing's been recorded yet, she said, flipping through the pages. But there's a pending transfer request submitted by a James Jensen. Says here the seller is you and your husband. I kept my voice light. Interesting. Guess I'll need to take a closer look at that before anything's finalized. I paid for copies and left gripping the manila folder like it was my shield. Back in my car, I read every line. It confirmed what I'd seen in Mark's envelope, but also revealed something new. James was trying to push the deal through before the end of the month, claiming it was a family asset consolidation. That gave me 2 weeks. 2 weeks to make sure this never happened, and to do it in a way that would leave them scrambling. I called Rachel, my cafe friend, and asked if she'd be willing to swear she saw Mark and James meeting about this. She didn't even hesitate. Absolutely. They looked shady as hell. Next, I called a real estate attorney, one who didn't know anyone in my family. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, then said, "Claire, you need to file a notice of homestead on that cabin. Today. Once it's recorded, they can't sell or transfer it without your explicit notarized consent. No one can sign for you, not even your husband." It was like hearing a lock click shut in my favor. I drove straight to her office, signed the forms, and by lunchtime the protection was officially in place. That night over dinner, I kept my tone casual. "Hey, I was thinking we should head up to the cabin next weekend. Get some fresh air." Mark hesitated. "I don't know if that's a good time. I've got things going on." "Oh, come on," I said with a smile I didn't feel. "It's been too long. We could even invite James, make it a family thing." He studied me for a second, like he was trying to read between the lines, but he didn't see anything because I'd made sure he wouldn't. Over the next week, I played the part of the oblivious wife. I laughed at his jokes, kissed him goodbye in the mornings, even asked how work was going. All the while, I was documenting everything: dates, conversations, receipts. By the time we drove up to the cabin that Friday, I had a folder ready, copies of the homestead notice, the pending transfer request, and a signed witness statement from Rachel. I kept it in my bag right next to my phone. We arrived just before sunset. James was already there, leaning against his truck like he owned the place. "Glad you could make it," he said, that smug smile plastered across his face. I smiled back, my heart steady. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't walking into one of their setups unarmed. They thought this weekend would be the final step in their plan. They didn't realize it was the first step in mine. And I was about to make sure they never forgot what happened when they tried to write me out of my own story. The air at the cabin was crisp, carrying that mix of pine and lake water that usually made me feel at peace. But tonight, it felt like the charged silence before a storm. Inside, James had already laid out a stack of papers on the kitchen table, the same ones I'd seen in Mark's envelope. He glanced at me like I was an uninvited guest in my own home. "Claire, we just need you to sign these. Make things cleaner for everyone." I didn't sit down. Cleaner for who exactly? Mark shot James a look like "don't push it," but James leaned back in his chair, all false calm. "Look, you're busy with your job, the kids. The cabin's a lot to maintain. It makes sense for me to take it on. You'll still be able to visit." I let out a soft laugh, the kind that says I see right through you. Interesting, because last I checked, you don't get to take on something that isn't yours. Mark's jaw tightened. "Claire, this is just a formality." "Oh, I know exactly what it is," I cut in, pulling my folder from my bag. "And I've made it a formality of my own." I slid the first document across the table, the notice of homestead complete with county stamp. "As of last week, this property can't be transferred, sold, or signed over without my notarized consent. Which, in case you're wondering, you will never get." James's smirk faltered. You think this little stunt is going to stop me? I leaned in, my voice low but sharp. It's not a stunt, James. It's the law. And while we're talking about laws, I pulled out Rachel's signed statement. I have a witness who saw the two of you conspiring to transfer my property without my knowledge. That's fraud. Mark's face drained of color. Claire? No, Mark, I said, locking eyes with him. You were ready to hand over the one place I love most to the man who spent his life cutting me down. And you thought I wouldn't find out. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the fridge. James broke the silence. You wouldn't take this to court. It's family. I smiled, slow and cold. Family is the reason I will take it to court. Because people like you count on blood ties to get away with whatever you want. I'm done letting you. I gathered the papers into my folder, stood and slung my bag over my shoulder. You can both stay here tonight if you want, but the cabin's mine. And from now on, you'll need my permission to step foot on it. I walked to the door, then turned back just once. Oh, and James, next time you think about taking something from me, remember I'm not the same Claire you used to know. I'll see you in court before I see you give me that smug smile again. Outside, the air hit my lungs like freedom. For the first time in years, I wasn't leaving one of these encounters feeling smaller. I felt bigger, clearer, in control. As I drove away, the cabin lights fading in my rearview mirror, I thought about everyone who's ever been underestimated by their own family. And if you've ever had someone try to write you out of your own story, maybe it's time to pick up the pen. Because when you do, you'll find out something powerful. They can't take what you refuse to give. And if you want to know what happened when Mark came home after that night, and how it changed everything for my kids, you're going to want to see what comes next. In the weeks that followed, the air in our home felt different. Lighter even in its awkward silences. Mark tried to start conversations sometimes about the kids, sometimes about nothing at all, but I no longer filled the space for him. I answered when I wanted to, and when I didn't, I let the quiet stand. The cabin stayed mine. I drove up there with Liam and Ava one crisp Saturday morning, just the three of us. We built a fire-roasted marshmallows, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the kind of peace that isn't dependent on anyone else's approval. Sitting on the porch that evening, watching the lake ripple in the sunset, I realized something important. This whole fight had never really been about property. It was about ownership of my life, about who gets to decide what's important to me. And the answer finally was me. I know some people might say I should have kept the peace, stayed quiet for the sake of family. But peace built on silence is just a slow erosion of yourself. Eventually, there's nothing left. If there's anything I hope you take from my story, it's this: you don't have to let people, even the ones you love, decide your worth. You don't have to accept less loyalty than you give. And you're allowed to draw a line, even if it means some people will never cross it again. Because sometimes the only way to protect what matters most is to stand up, even if you stand alone. And when you finally do, you'll find out you were never as alone as they made you feel.